When the longships appeared on the horizon, the world below them changed forever. The clash of iron, the roar of battle, those were only the beginning. When the swords fell silent and the shields lay broken, the real conquest began. For the Vikings, victory wasn't about land or honor. It was about people. Every raid was a harvest, and every village was a market waiting to be stripped bare. The men who died in battle were granted mercy in death, but their wives, their daughters, their mothers, they faced something far worse. As smoke rose from the ruins, the victors moved through the silence like wolves among the fallen. They didn't come for gold. They came for the living. Women were gathered, examined, and counted. Their names erased, their worth rewritten in silver. From the frozen fjords of Norway to the crowded docks of Dublin, a new kind of trade flourished, one that trafficked in hope, fear, and flesh. They were not plunderers acting on impulse. They were businessmen of brutality. Every chain, every ledger, every ship was part of a system built to turn human suffering into wealth. The wives of the defeated became numbers, the daughters of the fallen became profit, and the cries of a conquered people became the rhythm that drove an empire forward. This is not the story told in the sagas. This is the one hidden beneath them. The story of the women whose lives were sold, whose voices were silenced, and whose pain was recorded not in songs, but in ledgers. This is what the Vikings did after victory, and it was worse than death. The sea was calm that morning, a silence so heavy it seemed to wait for something terrible to begin. Then, from the fog, came the shapes, long wooden ships, their dragon heads rising through the mist like specters from a forgotten world. The rhythmic beat of oars cut through the still water, and with each stroke, the promise of death moved closer to shore. When the Vikings landed, it was not chaos that followed, it was order. The kind of order that comes from centuries of practice, from men who turned war into routine and conquest into commerce. Villages that had slept peacefully beneath the protection of their warriors now woke to the sound of horns, the crash of shields, and the inevitability of defeat. The men fought bravely, as all chronicles record, but bravery mattered little against numbers, discipline, and the cold efficiency of those who'd done this before. When the swords fell silent and the smoke of battle drifted into the gray morning sky, those who had defended their homes lay still on the ground. Their blood soaked the soil they had sworn to protect. For them, it was over. Death was an ending, a cruel one, but merciful in its finality. But for the ones who survived, the wives, the daughters, the mothers, the nightmare had only begun. The Vikings did not destroy for destruction's sake. They harvested. The real work began after victory. Their leaders moved through the wreckage, giving commands that their men obeyed with quiet precision. The fallen were stripped of weapons. Livestock were penned, and then the sorting began. Men to the left, women to the right, children in the middle. If they were old enough to walk, they were considered useful. If not, they were liabilities. The sorting was methodical, almost bureaucratic. Age, health, strength, and beauty, all measured, weighed, and recorded by men who had done this 100 times before. The women understood none of it at first. The language of their captors was strange, guttural, sharp. But the meaning of the gestures, the pointing, the grabbing, the prodding, was universal. They realized quickly what was happening, and those who screamed or ran were silenced in ways that left no question of what resistance would cost. By the time the sun reached its highest point, the process was complete. The village was no longer a community, it was a warehouse. The men were dead, the old forgotten, and the women were inventory. Names were stripped away. Each captive became a number, her identity replaced by a mark on a list. Scribes, yes, scribes, moved among the soldiers, ink-stained and expressionless, recording ages, appearances, and estimated value. This was not chaos. This was commerce. For the Vikings, the slave trade, thraldom, as they called it, was as vital to their wealth as silver or furs. Across the North Sea, human lives were as tradable as grain or timber. Dublin, Hedeby, Birka, ports that history remembers for trade and craftsmanship, were also the beating heart of a system built on captivity. The journey to those ports began immediately. Iron collars were fastened around necks. Ropes and chains connected dozens of women into a single, moving line. They marched across fields still wet with blood, through forests and bogs, toward the coast where ships waited like open mouths. For many, that march was a death sentence. Those who fell were left behind. Those who resisted were made examples of, punished in front of the others to keep the line moving. Every action had a purpose. Fear was the first lesson, obedience the second. By the time the women reached the shore, their world had shrunk to the length of a chain. The air reeked of salt and smoke. The ships loomed larger than anything they had ever seen. The same vessels that had carried warriors across oceans were now cargo ships for human souls. Inside, there was no light. The holds were narrow, wooden walls sweating with seawater, the air thick with sickness and despair. The captives were packed so tightly they could not lie down. Food came once a day, thin broth, hard bread. Water was rationed, calculated to keep them alive, but never strong. Some prayed. Some went silent forever. The sea took many before the ships reached their destination, their bodies thrown overboard like spoiled goods. And yet, when the longships finally arrived in port, the horror continued with new precision. The women were cleaned, groomed, made to appear presentable. In the slave markets of Dublin, they stood on wooden platforms beneath open skies, while merchants called out prices. Buyers examined their teeth, their hands, their hips. They asked questions not of the women, but of the men who had brought them there. Can she weave? Can she cook? Has she borne children? Each answer determined a destiny. The skilled became house servants or concubines. The strong went to fields. The beautiful were sold to nobles, to warlords, to foreign traders. Their value was measured in silver, sometimes enough to buy a farm, sometimes barely more than a goat. But for the wives of the defeated, the women of status, of standing, there was a different fate. Their humiliation was a message. Paraded before the very men who had once feared their husbands, they were forced into servitude not just as property, but as symbols. Symbols that power could strip dignity from anyone, no matter their name or birth. Inside the halls of Viking chieftains, these women became living trophies. They were renamed, redressed, made to serve at feasts as reminders of conquest. A kind word from a master could mean survival. A moment of defiance could mean starvation, or worse. Over time, many forgot their native tongue, not by choice, but by exhaustion. Silence became safer than memory. The Vikings recorded it all. Their ledgers listed slaves alongside weapons, livestock, and jewelry. To them, the difference was only in price. Archaeologists have found these records, etched in runes or written in ink, detailing the trade routes, the costs, even the expected lifespan of a thrall. It is this documentation, cold, factual, merciless, that tells us how vast the system truly was. In some Scandinavian settlements, 1 in every 4 people was enslaved. Entire generations of women vanished from history, absorbed into households where they bore children who would never know their mothers' names. For centuries, the machine ground on. Raids fed markets. Markets fed kingdoms. Kingdoms built ships that launched new raids. And through it all, the wives of the defeated remained its raw material, used, broken, forgotten. When we speak of the Vikings, we often imagine warriors, explorers, shipbuilders. We speak of bravery, discovery, adventure. But beneath that legend lies another truth. They built their world not only on courage, but on the backs of those they conquered. The men who died at their hands were granted an ending. Their wives were granted an eternity of survival. And sometimes, survival is the cruelest punishment of all. The sky had turned the color of steel by the time the survivors were gathered. The wind off the sea carried the scent of ash and wet iron. Behind them, the village was little more than smoke. Ahead, the road to nowhere stretched toward the coast. Chains clinked in uneven rhythm as the column of captives began to move. It wasn't chaos. It was procedure. The Vikings had perfected this march. Every step, every pause, every punishment. A choreography of control designed to move human cargo without breaking it beyond profit. The women were bound together by rope or by iron collars, linked at the neck so no one could flee without choking the others. Some stumbled over the corpses of the fallen. Others turned their faces away, afraid that looking back would make them lose the will to go on. Guards walked alongside, not shouting, not angry, just efficient. The whip cracked only when necessary. They had done this before. They knew exactly how much food to give, how much rest to allow. Too little, and the captives would die. Too much, and they might find the strength to resist. When night came, the column stopped in a field near the forest's edge. The air was cold, heavy with dew. The Vikings set up camp in silence. Fires burned low, guarded not to draw attention from afar. The women were herded into a circle, roped together and forced to sit. Some cried softly, most stared into the darkness, beyond exhaustion, beyond fear. A guard walked through the line, examining faces with a merchant's eye. He wasn't looking for rebellion. He was assessing condition, bruises, injuries, fatigue, anything that might reduce value at market. When he found a woman with a swollen ankle, he noted it with a grunt and moved on. Later, someone would decide whether she was worth carrying or killing. The next morning, they marched again. The path wound through forests and marshland, over streams and fields that had once fed their captives' own children. Now it fed the machine of conquest. At every stop, there were rules. No one spoke without permission. No one drank until told. The slightest sign of defiance brought punishment, swift and public. At one crossroads, a woman tried to run. She made it 10 steps before a guard struck her down. The others were forced to watch as her body was dragged back and displayed beside the path. The message was simple: hope is treason. By the time they reached the coast, the women had learned what silence meant. The sea stretched before them like a wall of gray glass, the horizon swallowing their future. Dozens of ships waited, their hulls slick with tar, their decks crowded with cargo that breathed. Loading began at dawn. Each captive was checked, counted, and chained to the next. The ship's holds were not built for people but for goods, barrels, furs, grain, and now, women. The space was narrow, the air thick with the smell of salt, wood, and fear. A scribe moved among them, marking names, not their real names, those were gone, but inventory codes. A mark for age, another for value, another for fertility. To the Vikings, this was not cruelty, it was logistics. The voyage lasted days, sometimes weeks. Storms turned the ships into prisons that tossed and groaned. When the waves struck, the women collided against the walls or each other, their bodies bruised and bloodied. Seasickness was constant. Food was scarce. The sick were removed, sometimes overboard, sometimes left on deck to die quietly under the gray sky. The crew did not look at them as people. They were numbers on a list. Those who survived long enough began to understand the rules of the new world. Compliance meant survival. Resistance meant starvation. They shared fragments of words, bits of Norse they'd picked up, enough to beg for water, enough to understand commands. The language of survival was simple. Days bled into nights. The rhythm of oars replaced the rhythm of heartbeats. Some prayed for rescue, others for death. But when land finally appeared on the horizon, few felt relief. The docks of Dublin loomed like the gates of another realm. This was no secret trade, no hidden shame. It was public. It was organized. The Viking markets operated in the open, with stalls, auction blocks, and pens designed not for animals, but for humans. When the ships arrived, buyers were already waiting. Merchants, nobles, emissaries from foreign lands, each looking for something different. Strength, skill, beauty, fertility. The dockworkers unloaded the human cargo with the same care they gave to barrels of silver. One by one, the women were led to holding areas, wooden enclosures that smelled of seaweed and sweat. They were washed with cold water, combed, and given new clothes, clean linen to hide the dirt, jewelry to mask the bruises. The presentation mattered. A well-kept slave fetched a higher price. When the market opened, the noise was deafening. Traders shouted bids, buyers inspected the captives, and scribes recorded transactions. A young woman with bright eyes and smooth hands might sell for the price of a farm. Another, older or scarred, might be bartered for a single weapon. Pregnant women were considered 2 for 1. The auctions were theatrical. The women stood on raised platforms as men circled below, discussing them like livestock. She can spin flax. She speaks Latin. She's strong, good for labor. Each word reduced a life to a commodity. Those with rare skills, reading, writing, herbal medicine, were the jewels of the market. They were bought by chieftains, merchants, even priests. The rest went to farms, to kitchens, to fields. Their destinations were recorded, their prices logged. The ledgers of human misery grew thicker with every raid. But for the wives of warriors, those captured as symbols of power, the market was not the end. They were reserved for private sales, for noble buyers who saw humiliation as conquest. These women were paraded through great halls, renamed in Norse tongues, and forced to serve the very men who had slaughtered their kin. They were not killed because their suffering was more valuable alive. Some broke quickly. Others learned to survive by pretending to forget who they were. Those who bore children watched them grow as strangers, property of the men who had destroyed their families. And through it all, the Vikings kept records, numbers, prices, routes. They wrote everything down with the same precision they used to build ships. They believed in documentation, in control, in efficiency. To them, the trade was not evil, it was order. To the women, it was erasure. When the sun set over the Dublin harbor, the water glowed red with reflection, not blood, but close enough. The ships emptied, ready for the next voyage, the next raid, the next harvest of human lives. In the quiet that followed, only the sound of chains remained, clinking softly like wind chimes in the cold sea air. The market would reopen tomorrow, and somewhere, far across the water, another village would sleep beneath a peaceful sky, until the oars began to beat again. The longships slid through the gray water and reached their harbors with quiet precision. The markets had taken their share. The silver had changed hands. But for some women, the journey didn't end with the auctioneer's shout. Their value wasn't counted in coins alone. It was measured in symbolism, in humiliation, in power. These were the women sent to the great halls. The halls of Viking lords were not the wooden sanctuaries of legend, not places of honor, song, and feasting that the sagas later celebrated. In reality, they were the centers of domination. Beneath the flickering light of the hearth, power wore the mask of civilization. Gold shone on walls built from grief. The halls were vast but cold, built to intimidate. The fire pit burned endlessly in the center, smoke curling into the rafters where shields hung as trophies. And among the servants who moved through the shadows were the women, wives of warriors, daughters of leaders, once proud, now silent. They were renamed immediately. Their given names, those spoken in childhood, whispered by husbands, prayed by mothers, were forbidden. In their place, the masters chose new names, Norse words that fit easier on their tongues, words that meant little, quiet, or servant. It was the first step of erasure. Religion followed next. Those who had crossed themselves in prayer were forced to kneel before Odin's altar. The rituals were public, meant to be spectacles of surrender. Crosses were replaced with Thor's hammers. The women were commanded to pour wine as offerings, to sing chants they did not understand, to pretend devotion while their faith withered inside them. Defiance brought punishment. Averted eyes, a muttered prayer, even suspicion of resistance was enough. Beatings were public, starvation was private. Some women broke quickly. Others learned to survive by disappearing behind masks of obedience. The Great Hall was a theater of control. Lords and warriors drank, laughed, boasted. The women served food and poured mead, their movements choreographed to avoid attention and avoid anger. They learned to read the smallest cues, a change in tone, a twitch of a hand, that foretold whether the next word would be a command or a blow. At night, the hall grew quiet, but not safe. A single gesture from a master could summon one of them to his quarters. There were no refusals. Pregnancy offered no protection. It was proof of usefulness. A woman who bore a child increased her master's wealth. Her pain became investment. The children born in bondage never belonged to their mothers. From the moment they took their first breath, they were property. Boys were raised for labor or war. Girls were trained to serve. Mothers watched their children grow into strangers who called another man father. Yet even in this darkness, fragments of humanity survived. Some women whispered prayers in secret, tracing invisible crosses on their palms. Others taught their children old words in hushed tones before the overseers entered. They hid pieces of themselves in lullabies, in stories told as if they were fairy tales, fragments of who they had been before the ships came. But the system was designed to crush even that. The hierarchy among slaves was deliberate. Some were given small privileges, extra food, lighter duties, to keep them loyal. They became intermediaries, enforcing discipline among others. Division kept rebellion impossible. Viking masters understood psychology long before the word existed. They alternated cruelty and kindness to create confusion. A harsh winter could bring sudden generosity, warm clothes, extra bread, only to be followed by renewed control. Gratitude became a weapon. When kindness came from the same hand that inflicted pain, loyalty and fear blurred until they were indistinguishable. Years passed like this, seasons marked by raids, births, and deaths. Women who had once been noble learned to scrub floors and serve beer. Some eventually earned limited freedom, the right to walk unchained, to manage a household. But freedom within the hall was still captivity by another name. Leaving was unthinkable. Their old homes were gone, their families dead or enslaved. The hall had become their entire world. Outside, the trade continued. New captives replaced the old. The system fed itself. Raids brought slaves, slaves brought wealth, wealth built ships, ships launched new raids. The same hands that carved runestones praising the gods also inked ledgers that recorded human beings. The law sanctioned it all. In early Scandinavian codes, a thrall was listed beside livestock, tools, and land. The penalties for killing one were lower than for killing a free man's dog. A master could sell, lend, or even gamble away his slaves. The only real crime was damaging someone else's property. And yet, the brutality was wrapped in ritual. The Vikings saw themselves not as villains, but as participants in the order of the world. Captives were spoils of war, gifts from Odin, proof of divine favor. Skalds, poets, sang of great victories and beautiful foreign women taken as prizes. The songs made the horror sound noble. Children grew up hearing these tales by the hearth, learning that dominance was destiny. But under the rhythm of those songs, the real stories survived, in whispers, in scars, in bones. Archaeologists have found the remains of women buried without names, without jewelry, without honor. Some were buried with their masters, killed to accompany them to the afterlife. The marks on their bones tell of malnutrition, overwork, and repeated trauma. Their bodies became the silent archive of a system that erased its victims in every other way. And still, the machinery turned. The women who had been captured decades earlier watched new ships return from raids, their decks heavy with weeping cargo. The sound of chains and foreign cries echoed through the harbors again. Every generation repeated the cycle: conquer, capture, consume. For the wives of the defeated, survival meant forgetting. They stopped counting days, stopped praying aloud, stopped imagining rescue. To endure, they became invisible, shadows in the hall, whispers in the dark. Yet history did not forget them entirely. Traces remain, in chronicles written by monks horrified by what they witnessed, in sagas that tried to disguise slavery as romance, in the genetic threads woven into the descendants of both captor and captive. The great halls eventually crumbled, their fires long extinguished. The songs of triumph faded, but the silence of those who served in the shadows endures. The Vikings are remembered as explorers, builders, and warriors, but beneath their legend lies a truth carved not in stone, but in pain. Their empires were not sustained by courage alone, but by the breaking of countless lives. Inside those halls, civilization and cruelty walked hand in hand. The laughter of warriors echoed above the muffled sobs of the enslaved. Every feast, every toast, every poem was built upon the quiet suffering of those whose names were erased. And when history speaks of their greatness, it is worth remembering that behind every throne stood a woman whose story was never told, because she was never meant to survive to tell it. The great halls would one day fall silent. The fires that once glowed on carved wooden walls would fade into ash, and the songs that celebrated victory would dissolve into legend. But the machine the Vikings built, the system that turned conquest into commerce, did not vanish overnight. It evolved, adapted, and left its mark on everything that came after. The brutality was not chaos, it was written into law. Across the north, as kingdoms began to form and codify their customs, slavery was treated not as crime, but as commerce. The earliest Scandinavian legal codes, the Grágis in Iceland, the Gulathing and Frostathing laws in Norway, and the Jutland law in Denmark, all preserved one unflinching truth: a thrall was property. A man could sell his slave as he might sell a horse, lend one to settle a debt, or bequeath them to his heirs. The law even provided for compensation if a slave was damaged, as though a person were a broken tool. The value of a life was not measured in humanity, but in silver. For women, the rules were harsher still. Their worth was often tied to beauty, fertility, or skill. Masters were required to disclose defects before sale, blindness, sickness, infertility, and could face restitution if they failed to do so. Not because of moral conscience, but because deceit threatened profit. The courts existed to protect commerce, not compassion. Even punishment had price. A man who killed another slave could be fined the slave's market value. A man who freed a slave without permission could owe compensation to the original owner. And any free person who dared to help a thrall escape risked the same fate: fines, confiscation of property, or even enslavement themselves. It was a web that bound everyone, master, merchant, bystander, into complicity. The machinery of control extended beyond law into religion and culture. The Norse sagas, written centuries later when Christianity had begun to reshape the North, rarely condemned slavery. Instead, they romanticized it. Heroes were praised for capturing beautiful foreign women, for bringing spoils of the South back to their halls. These tales transformed victims into trophies, cruelty into conquest. The poets and skalds, those keepers of memory, helped sanitize atrocity. They called it destiny, divine reward, the will of the gods. And so a civilization that prided itself on honor found justification for horror within its own myths. But the bones tell a different story. Archaeologists have uncovered the silent evidence. Iron shackles designed for human wrists, collar locks etched with runes, and underground chambers with reinforced doors where captives were kept. In Birka, Sweden's great trading city, remains of women show signs of chronic malnutrition and stress fractures in their spines, evidence of overwork and long-term abuse. In Hedeby, Denmark, the foundations of holding houses still bear marks of iron rings bolted into stone, anchors for chains. Even graves tell the truth. Free Vikings were buried with jewelry, weapons, and the trappings of honor. Slaves were often buried hastily, sometimes decapitated, sometimes laid at the feet of their masters, a final act of ownership carried into death. Some graves reveal an even darker practice: sacrifice. When a wealthy Viking died, his household might send servants and concubines to accompany him to Valhalla. Chronicles from Arab travelers who visited the north describe these rituals with chilling clarity. Women given intoxicants, paraded, then killed to follow their masters beyond the veil. It was not faith. It was domination disguised as religion. And yet, the system's reach went beyond Scandinavia. Viking traders carried their human cargo across Europe, from Ireland to the Baltic, from France to the Islamic world. The women they captured reshaped populations. Modern DNA studies show traces of Celtic, Slavic, and Anglo-Saxon lineages spread deep into Scandinavian bloodlines, genetic echoes of captivity. Historians once believed the Viking Age ended around the 11th century, when Christianization and monarchies replaced tribal rule. But for many women, the chains simply changed form. The slave markets faded, but the social hierarchies they built endured, a legacy of ownership, of inherited power, of silent endurance. In the centuries that followed, the Norse word thrall evolved into words like serf, bondservant, and eventually slave. Each new age softened the language but preserved the system. Human lives remained the currency of progress. The Vikings were not unique in their cruelty. What made them remarkable was their efficiency, the way they transformed violence into policy and policy into economy. They understood something chillingly modern: that suffering could be organized, documented, monetized. Their ledgers were not metaphors. They were real. Lists written in ink and blood, filled with names that no longer exist. These records, fragments found in trade towns and legal archives, describe not just who was sold, but for how much, to whom, and for what purpose. Some even note delivery routes, maintenance costs, and losses during transport. It was the birth of bureaucracy, and bureaucracy, in its cold neutrality, makes cruelty sustainable. That is the true legacy of the Viking slave system, not simply the violence itself, but the normalization of it. A world where atrocity was not an accident, but an industry. And yet, beneath the ice and iron, humanity endured. In hidden moments, acts of defiance survived, small, quiet, unnoticed by history. A woman teaching her child an outlawed prayer. A mother whispering her true name before sleep. A captive helping another escape, knowing it meant death. These fragments are all that remain of resistance in a world that erased those who dared to resist. When Christianity spread through the North, it promised freedom to all souls, but in practice, it often only rebranded bondage. Servants of God replaced thralls of men. The old system dissolved into feudal hierarchies, and new empires rose on the same foundations of power and obedience. Still, the stories of those who suffered refused to die completely. They lingered in superstition and folklore, the ghost women of Scandinavian legend, spirits that haunt the shores where longships once docked, calling for children who never returned. In some regions, ancient place names still bear traces of their memory. Trolsund, Trelleborg, the Bay of Slaves, the Fortress of Thralls. Centuries later, when the sagas were finally written down, their authors glossed over the slave markets, the broken families, the endless chains. But the silences in those texts speak as loudly as the words. The gaps, the parts not told, are where the truth hides. Today, archaeology and genetics are giving voice to those silenced lives. Every bone unearthed, every artifact cataloged, restores a fragment of what was lost. The data tells the story the poets refused to sing. And in that story, one lesson remains unchanged. Civilizations are remembered not only for their triumphs, but for the suffering they build upon. The Viking Age gave the world ships, trade routes, art, and myth, but beneath it all lay a system that perfected the art of human exploitation. It ended not through moral awakening, but through changing economics, shifting faith, and political evolution. Yet, the echoes endure. The vocabulary of dominance, the romanticization of conquest, the fascination with power, they still ripple through the modern imagination. When we tell the tales of the Vikings today, of their bravery, their adventure, their exploration, we must remember those who paid the price for those stories to exist. Because behind every saga of glory stands a silence. Behind every hero's feast, an empty bowl. Behind every empire, a ledger. And in those ledgers lie the names of women whose voices were stolen, whose stories were buried beneath centuries of myth-making, but whose truth, once uncovered, demands to be remembered. Centuries passed, and the sound of oars faded from Europe's shores. The longships rotted in their harbors, their dragon heads splintered and blackened by time. The world moved on, but the ghosts of the old trade did not rest. They lingered, in bones, in bloodlines, in stories told and retold, until their meanings blurred between truth and myth. The machine of conquest had finally stopped, not because of guilt, but because the world had changed around it. Trade routes shifted, faiths collided, kingdoms rose that no longer needed slaves to fuel their wealth. But by then, the damage was done. The Viking world had already written its legacy, carved into stone, sung in sagas, and hidden in the silence of those it had erased. Christianity swept across the north, bringing new gods, new rules, new ideas of mercy. Kings outlawed human bondage, but old habits die hard. The practice continued in shadows, disguised as servitude, justified as divine hierarchy. Serve your Lord as you serve your God, they preached. Chains became metaphors, but captivity endured. Yet with time, something else began to take root: memory. The chroniclers of the Middle Ages, writing from monasteries once burned by the Norse, recorded their anger in ink. They described the raiders as heathens, demons, destroyers. But buried in their outrage was also truth, an unflinching record of how entire populations were taken, how women vanished, how villages never recovered. These texts became the conscience the Vikings never wrote for themselves. And then, centuries later, archaeologists uncovered what the poets ignored: the artifacts of pain that could not be romanticized. Shackles buried beneath trading posts, human teeth filed from malnutrition, child bones, small and fragile, found beside the remains of women in unmarked graves. Each discovery was a voice rising from the earth, whispering what the sagas had tried to forget. The image of the Viking, wild, brave, free, began to crack. Beneath the horned helmets of legend, which they never wore, lay a society as complex as it was cruel. They were farmers, explorers, traders, and traffickers. The truth didn't erase their achievements, but it stripped away their innocence. For centuries, Western history celebrated the Viking as a symbol of courage, of adventure, of man's hunger to explore the unknown. Films, books, and myths painted them as heroes of the North, storm-born warriors chasing destiny. Few spoke of the women chained beneath their decks, the ledgers written in their blood. But history has a way of demanding balance. In modern Scandinavia, scholars, artists, and descendants have begun to confront this silence. Museums that once displayed swords and helmets now also exhibit shackles and collars. Educational programs tell both stories, the bravery and the brutality, the expansion and the exploitation. It is a reckoning long overdue. Still, resistance remains. National pride and myth are powerful allies, and for some, acknowledging the darkness feels like betrayal. They were products of their time, people say, as if that erases the screams carried by the sea. But time does not absolve cruelty. It only buries it deeper, waiting to be unearthed. What makes the Viking legacy haunting is not that they were monsters, but that they were human, organized, intelligent, creative, and still capable of such systematic horror. They prove that civilization and savagery can coexist, that progress can be built upon suffering. It is a pattern repeated across human history. Empires rise, and beneath their marble floors lie bones. The Vikings were simply one chapter in that eternal book, the story of how power turns people into resources. Yet, not all memory is despair. Traces of the enslaved still pulse through history's veins. Genetic studies across Europe show the movement of women from Ireland, England, and the Slavic regions into Scandinavia during the Viking Age. Their descendants walk among us today, their bloodlines quiet but enduring. In their survival, there is victory. The mothers who whispered their languages to children forbidden to speak them ensured that their cultures didn't vanish entirely. The women who endured, who outlived their masters, who adapted and rebuilt, carried fragments of resistance through generations. They were more than victims, they were witnesses. Their story forces us to look at history differently, not as a chain of glory, but as a mirror of consequence. For every ship launched, someone was chained. For every saga sung, someone was silenced. The measure of civilization, perhaps, is not in its victories, but in how honestly it remembers its crimes. Today, when longship replicas glide across tourist waters and TV dramas glorify warrior kings, the question remains, what do we choose to remember, and what do we choose to forget? The sagas we tell about the past shape the morality of the present. If we erase the pain, we risk repeating it under new banners, new ships, new chains. In the end, the Viking world fell not because of defeat, but because it outlived its own usefulness. The machine they built had consumed everything: people, villages, faith, until there was nothing left to take. Trade shifted south. Christianity outlawed slavery. The old gods fell silent. The industry of human misery collapsed under the weight of its own profit. But its echoes never stopped. Every time a story glorifies conquest without consequence, a piece of that machine whirs again. Every time a culture turns people into numbers, or bodies into statistics, or suffering into spectacle, it continues the legacy of those ledgers carved by Viking scribes. And yet, in remembering, there is power. To tell the truth is to undo the silence. To speak the names that were erased, even if we do not know them, is to give back the humanity they were denied. When we look at the ruins of Viking halls, at the worn carvings of gods who demanded victory at any cost, we should also remember the women who once knelt beneath those roofs. Their stories are not side notes to history. They are history, the hidden foundation upon which empires were built. The ocean that carried the longships now carries only waves. The docks are gone, the markets are silent. But when the wind moves over the northern waters, there is a sound, faint, rhythmic, like the echo of oars. Maybe it's just the sea, or maybe it's memory. Because memory doesn't die. It endures in bones, in blood, in the stories we choose to tell. And in telling this one, the story of how victory became a machine, how civilization devoured its own soul, we honor the women who were meant to be forgotten. They were not numbers. They were not property. They were human. They lived. And through us, they will be remembered. The sea that once carried the longships is quiet now. No war horns, no sails on the horizon, only the endless rhythm of water meeting stone. But silence is not the same as peace. Beneath the calm, the past still breathes. Every wave that touches the northern coast carries whispers of the women who never returned. Centuries have passed, and yet the story of the Viking Age remains alive. In museums, in textbooks, in pop culture. We remember their courage, their craftsmanship, their ships that crossed oceans. We speak of their gods, their myths, their exploration of unknown worlds. But behind every heroic tale lies a shadow, the echo of what they did to the conquered and what the conquered left behind. History often chooses its heroes carefully. It records the names of kings and raiders, but leaves out the nameless. Yet, if we listen closely, the silence between those names speaks volumes. The Viking Age, for all its grandeur, was built upon the bones of the voiceless. And though their stories were buried, the earth has begun to give them back. Archaeologists today walk the same soil where villages once burned. They uncover bracelets that once belonged to captives, runestones carved not by free hands but by slaves, and graves that tell stories no saga dared to speak. In Sweden, a burial mound reveals a woman laid to rest without offerings, her skull showing signs of repeated trauma. In Norway, near a former trading post, shackles lie rusted beside coins, silver marked with Arabic inscriptions, proof of the international reach of this ancient trade. Each artifact is a heartbeat, a fragment of truth that refuses to die. But these discoveries are not just about history. They are about us, the way we remember, the way we choose to see. For centuries, the narrative of the Vikings was shaped by admiration. They were explorers, traders, warriors, the embodiment of human ambition. But ambition, unchecked by empathy, breeds empire. And empire always demands sacrifice. The Viking world was no different. They mastered organization, navigation, and strategy. They understood trade better than any of their contemporaries. And in that mastery, they also perfected cruelty, not as chaos, but as structure. That is perhaps the most terrifying part of their legacy. How something so brutal could be so rational. The bureaucracy of suffering they created, the ledgers, the trade routes, the codified ownership of people, did not end with them. Those same patterns resurfaced again and again throughout history. In medieval serfdom, in the transatlantic slave trade, in colonial exploitation, in industrial labor systems that valued production over humanity. The Vikings may have vanished, but the logic of their empire lived on. Every age has its longships. Every empire finds its thralls. In our modern world, the methods have changed, but the ghosts remain. We no longer hear the clank of iron chains, but we still build systems that commodify people, systems that turn workers into numbers, refugees into statistics, suffering into profit. The machine has evolved, but the heartbeat beneath it is the same. And so, the story of the Viking women, the wives of the defeated, the enslaved, the forgotten, becomes more than a tragedy of the past. It becomes a mirror. It asks us, when power becomes efficient, when suffering becomes invisible, how long before we forget that we are human? The women who were taken were not soldiers, not rulers, not warriors. They were ordinary, mothers, daughters, healers, storytellers. And it was precisely their ordinariness that made their suffering so profound. They represented the heart of every community destroyed by greed. Their memory endures not in statues or inscriptions, but in the persistence of compassion, in every person who refuses to look away from history's darker corners. Today, in Scandinavian museums, exhibitions dedicated to the enslaved are slowly emerging. Visitors can see the iron collars, the shackles, the fragments of jewelry, and read the reconstructed ledgers where women were reduced to lines of ink. It is uncomfortable. It should be. Because the point of remembrance is not to glorify, but to humanize. For centuries, the sagas told one story, that the Vikings conquered because they were strong, that the gods rewarded their courage. Now, the earth tells another, that strength built on suffering leaves wounds that never heal. And maybe that is the lesson the past offers us. Greatness without empathy is hollow. The real measure of civilization is not in how far it travels or how much it conquers, but in how it treats the powerless. The winds still blow across the North Sea, sweeping over the ruins of old fortresses and forgotten harbors. If you stand there long enough, you can almost hear them, faint voices in the mist, the creak of wood, the whisper of oars. The ghosts are not angry. They are waiting, waiting to be remembered, to be acknowledged not as shadows, but as lives that mattered. Because memory is resistance. When we name the unnamed, when we tell the stories that history tried to bury, we break the cycle that turns suffering into silence. The women the Vikings enslaved are not gone. They live in the bloodlines of millions, in the cultures that rose from their endurance, in the empathy that grows when truth is finally spoken. Their legacy is not one of defeat. It is one of survival. For centuries, they were erased, their bodies discarded, their names forgotten. Yet somehow, they remain. Through DNA, through song, through story, through the very persistence of human compassion, they endure. And so the Viking Age ends not with a sword, but with a whisper. A reminder that every civilization that rises must one day answer for the voices it silenced. The machine that turned victory into commerce is gone. The ships have sunk. The markets have vanished. But the memory remains, raw, echoing, alive. And perhaps that is the true victory. That centuries later, in a world they could never imagine, their story is being told not by conquerors, but by those who remember the conquered. Their suffering has become testimony. Their silence has become warning. And in that transformation, from commodity to remembrance, from ledger to legend, the wives of the defeated have finally reclaimed what was stolen from them. Their humanity. The past never truly ends. It lingers in the stones beneath our feet, in the blood that flows through generations, and in the stories we choose to tell or ignore. The Viking Age is remembered for its bravery, exploration, and mythic grandeur. But beneath the songs of heroism lies a silence far louder than any war cry. The silence of those who could not speak for themselves. This is their chapter. The final one. The one that was never written. The camera opens on a windswept fjord, gray clouds mirrored in still water. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the world has changed. Ships no longer sail for conquest. Kings no longer buy and sell human lives. But the ghosts remain, woven into the very fabric of history. For centuries, the voices of Viking women, the captured, the enslaved, the forgotten, were erased by those who controlled the quills. History, written by the victors, reduced them to whispers or footnotes. But now, with each artifact unearthed, with every record re-examined, their presence grows louder. Archaeologists no longer dig for gold, they dig for truth. And in that truth, the shape of a civilization emerges, one both magnificent and monstrous. The Vikings mastered the art of storytelling, yet it was their victims who carried the truest stories, etched not in parchment, but in pain. The wives of the defeated, once treated as spoils, have become the most enduring witnesses of that age. Through them, we learn that the Viking world was not only a saga of adventure, but also an empire of exploitation. Their suffering was not incidental, it was the foundation. The modern mind struggles to comprehend such contradiction. How a culture so creative could be so cruel. How the same hands that carved intricate jewelry could forge shackles. How the same people who built ships capable of crossing oceans also built systems that erase souls. The answer, perhaps, lies in something timeless, the human capacity to justify anything when it serves power. Today, as historians re-examine the Viking legacy, the narrative is shifting. Once glorified for conquest, they are now studied for complexity. Their brutality no longer hides behind poetry and myth. The wives, daughters, and mothers who vanished into their world are finally emerging from the shadows. Museums across Scandinavia and Europe are reinterpreting their exhibitions. The glint of bronze swords is now displayed beside the rust of chains. Visitors stand in silence before glass cases holding iron collars and trading coins stamped with Arabic script, proof of the global reach of their human commerce. In one exhibit in Roskilde, Denmark, the names of known enslaved women are inscribed on translucent panels, each one glowing softly under dim light, like souls suspended in time. There are few names, because few survived in writing. But the absence itself tells a story. The blank spaces between the names are as powerful as the names themselves. The Viking world thrived on both innovation and oblivion. Its people explored faraway lands, Greenland, Iceland, even North America, but within their own communities, they buried the memory of those they enslaved. It took 1,000 years for the truth to resurface, for the women of the past to reclaim their voices. And now, through storytelling, through truth, they speak again. Listen closely. In every saga, there is a rhythm, a pulse beneath the words. The Eddas speak of gods and heroes, but behind those myths are metaphors for power, for fate, for control. Odin demanded sacrifice for wisdom. Thor's hammer brought order through violence. These weren't just divine tales. They were reflections of human society. The Viking gods were cruel because their world was. But even within that cruelty, fragments of resistance survived. Songs passed down through centuries speak of the weeping wife or the ghost in the hall, figures that scholars now believe represent enslaved women whose grief became legend. Their pain was transformed into folklore because it could not be told as truth. And so, myth became memory's disguise. The reckoning continues beyond Scandinavia. Across Europe, nations once raided by the Norse are rediscovering how deeply those invasions scarred their ancestry. In Ireland, genetic studies reveal Nordic bloodlines intertwined with Gaelic ones, descendants of both conquerors and captives. In England, linguistic traces remain. Words of Old Norse origin woven into the English language like invisible chains linking past and present. Even today, descendants of those captives walk unknowingly with Viking blood in their veins, a reminder that oppression, though it destroys, also transforms. The legacy of the enslaved is not just tragedy, but resilience. The story's end is not vengeance, it is understanding. History cannot be undone, but it can be told honestly. The purpose of remembering is not to condemn a people, but to acknowledge the full shape of their humanity, both their brilliance and their brutality. When we tell the story of the Viking Age, we must tell it whole, not as legend, but as truth, not as the glory of the few, but as the endurance of the many. The wives of the defeated did not die forgotten. Their stories have crossed centuries to reach us, not in their own words, but through the echoes they left behind. Every bone unearthed, every chain retrieved, every myth retold with honesty is an act of resurrection. They live now in the telling. The camera moves once more to the shore. The sky is breaking open with morning light. The ocean reflects gold where once it reflected fire. A woman, not a queen, not a slave, just a symbol of them all, stands where the tide meets the sand. The wind carries her hair, the surf curls around her feet. She looks out at the horizon. The world that took her is gone. The world that forgot her is remembering. Behind her, a child's laughter echoes faintly, maybe real, maybe imagined, blending with the wind. It is the sound of continuity, of life beyond suffering. The longships are gone, the markets turned to ruins, the halls to dust. But the memory endures. And in that endurance lies redemption. Because remembrance is the only victory left to the conquered. Fade to black. Soft voiceover. They came with fire and steel. They left with silver and souls. But the voices they silenced became the ones that history could not forget. Music swells, a mix of Nordic choir and distant waves. This is not just the story of the Vikings. It is the story of us, of what happens when ambition forgets compassion, and of how truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds its way to the surface. The screen fades again, not to darkness, but to light, for the women who were never named, for the lives that were never mourned. This is your story, and at last, the world is listening. The wind moves across the northern sea like a whisper from another age. The waves rise and fall, breaking softly against cliffs once blackened by fire. Time has washed the blood away, but not the memory. The land still remembers. It always does. When people speak of the Vikings, they speak of glory, of ships that cut through the ocean like knives through glass, of warriors who feared no death, of gods who demanded courage. Yet beneath that myth, beneath the rhythm of drums and the blaze of conquest, lies something older, quieter, and infinitely more human: the cost. The Viking Age is gone, but the structure it built, the idea that human worth can be measured, traded, and erased, survives in ways that should unsettle us. It hides in modern systems, in hierarchies that decide whose suffering matters and whose is ignored. It survives whenever silence is easier than truth. History does not simply end, it echoes. And so, the echo of the enslaved wives, the forgotten, the conquered, travels across centuries. It whispers from the bones unearthed in Burka, from the rusted chains of Hedeby, from the anonymous graves that the coasts of the North Sea. It speaks not in words, but in the quiet defiance of having existed at all. Their lives remind us that memory is a form of resistance. For centuries, they were reduced to shadows and stories told by men, nameless women who existed only as symbols of loss or victory. But the truth is more powerful than any legend. These women were the pulse of their societies. They cooked, healed, wove, birthed, and endured. And when everything was taken from them, they became something the Vikings never intended: witnesses. Today, those witnesses speak again. Through archaeology, through DNA, through art and scholarship, their humanity is being restored piece by piece. The work is slow, painstaking, and incomplete, but it is happening. Each fragment of pottery, each clasp of iron, each tooth found in the soil is another word in the story they were denied. Museums now tell their side. Classrooms teach it. Filmmakers, historians, and storytellers give them voice. Not as background, but as center. Not as victims, but as survivors. It is fitting, perhaps, that their story comes to light in an age defined by rediscovery. A time when the world itself is confronting the price of its own myths. Because the Viking Age is not just a chapter of history. It is a mirror reflecting how civilizations rise and what they are willing to sacrifice to stay standing. For all their brutality, the Vikings were not inhuman. That is what makes them terrifying and relatable. They built societies of beauty and intelligence. They composed poetry, crafted jewelry of breathtaking delicacy, and sailed farther than anyone thought possible. They prayed, they loved, they grieved, and still they enslaved. That contradiction is the essence of humanity, our endless capacity to create and destroy, to justify cruelty in the name of progress. The wives of the defeated were caught in that contradiction. They were not part of the sagas, yet their presence shaped them. Every conquest, every feast, every child born into those halls carried the unseen labor of enslaved hands. Every victory song rang above their silence. The Vikings are long gone, but the question they leave behind endures. How will we be remembered? Will future generations see us as the explorers or as the enslavers? Will they see our technology, our art, our ambition, or the suffering we ignored to achieve them? History teaches nothing to those who refuse to listen. The true legacy of the Viking Age is not in the ships that crossed the seas, but in the warning they left behind. That civilization built without compassion becomes its own kind of barbarism. And so, the ocean keeps its vigil. Somewhere beneath the cold water lie the remnants of 1,000 voyages. The wood has rotted, the metal has rusted, but the stories remain. The ocean remembers everything. The oars that carried warriors to glory, the tears of women carried far from home. It is all there, swirling beneath the waves, waiting for us to look deeper. When the camera moves across the northern horizon, the light changes. The day fades into dusk, and the sea burns gold for a moment before sinking into gray. A single raven circles above the cliffs, a messenger, a memory. In Norse myth, ravens were Odin's eyes and ears, gathering the world's stories to whisper them back to him. But in this story, the raven belongs to the women. It carries their memory, their grief, their defiance. It carries the truth. The wind rises, carrying fragments of song, not of war, but of mourning. The melody is soft, ancient, almost unrecognizable. It might be imagination, or it might be history finding its way back through time. Because history does not vanish. It waits, patient, persistent, immortal. And when it speaks, it does not shout. It whispers. In the whisper of the sea, in the rustle of leaves, in the stories finally being told, the wives of the defeated are no longer silent. They stand again, not as property, but as people. Not as numbers, but as names reborn through remembrance. Their suffering cannot be undone, but their silence can be. And perhaps that is what redemption truly means. Not erasing the darkness, but bringing light to it. The Viking Age taught us how far humanity can travel, how much it can build, how deep it can fall. The story of its forgotten women teaches us something greater, how we can remember. The longships are gone. The gods have faded. The halls have turned to dust. But the memory endures, carried by wind, by water, by story. And somewhere, far beyond the horizon, the voices once lost in the roar of conquest rise again, soft but unbroken. We were here. We mattered. Remember us. The sea has taken back everything. The ships, the bones, the cries. All that remains is wind and water and memory. The camera drifts across a vast northern horizon. Mist rolls low over dark waves. In the distance, the remnants of a wooden pier crumble into the tide. The world looks untouched, but beneath its silence lie centuries of voices waiting to be heard. The story began with conquest, with sails blackening the sky and swords splitting the dawn. But it ends here, in quiet reckoning. The longships no longer cut through the waters. Their names are lost. Their gods are forgotten. What endures are not the conquerors, but the conquered, the women whose lives were stolen and whose silence outlasted the roar of empires. History remembers the Vikings as warriors, explorers, builders of kingdoms. But history is never a single voice. It is a choir, and for too long, half its singers were bound and gagged. Now, at last, their melody begins to rise again. The light changes. The scene fades from ocean to earth. A slow pan across the ruins of an old Viking settlement. Moss-covered timbers, broken hearthstones, the faint outline of a longhouse now claimed by grass and time. Insects hum where once there was laughter. The ghosts of 1,000 meals, 1,000 songs, 1,000 commands still cling to the air. The camera moves closer, to a small, unmarked grave by the edge of the field. There is no inscription, only stones arranged in the rough shape of a circle. A child's toy lies nearby, carved from wood, its features long eroded. This is what remains of empire. No monuments, no heroes, just the echo of lives that once breathed beneath the weight of another's power. Voiceover. They thought they built eternity from silver and blood. But eternity is not made of gold. It is made of memory. Centuries later, the descendants of those who ruled and those who served share the same lands, the same bloodlines. The boundaries between conqueror and captive have dissolved, replaced by the quiet unity of time. The Norse genes that once spread through violence now flow in peace. The children of the enslaved walk the same coasts their ancestors once crossed in chains. Archaeologists unearth fragments of the past and hold them up to the light. A clasp, a coin, a strand of hair preserved in soil. Each piece tells the same truth, that even the smallest remnant carries the weight of a life. And through these discoveries, something extraordinary happens. Empathy becomes archaeology. The past ceases to be legend and becomes human again. In Copenhagen, a curator stands before a new exhibition titled Thralls of the North. Behind glass, a collection of shackles glints under soft light. A plaque reads, "They were never meant to be remembered." And yet, here they are. Visitors move slowly through the gallery. Some whisper, some cry. All leave changed. Because this is what history does when it's told honestly. It transforms silence into understanding. Outside, in the streets of modern Scandinavia, the old symbols of the Vikings remain. Carved dragons, mead halls, festivals celebrating Norse gods. But now, alongside them, new memorials rise, sculptures of women standing in defiance, hands unclenched, eyes open toward the sea. Not as victims, but as survivors. Their story is no longer buried in footnotes. It is spoken, written, filmed, remembered. And in remembering them, we learn something about ourselves. The scene shifts again, from past to present, from myth to reality. A drone shot sweeps over the northern coast. The sun is low, gold melting into blue. A single figure walks along the shoreline, the same woman seen in earlier visions, her cloak trailing behind her, hair loose in the wind. She is not one person. She is all of them. The wives who watched their homes burn. The daughters dragged from battlefields. The mothers who bore children into captivity. The generations who carried that memory quietly until it became part of the landscape itself. She stops at the water's edge. The tide reaches her feet, retreating and returning in rhythm, as if the ocean breathes with her. She closes her eyes. The voiceover returns, quiet, steady, resolute. The Vikings are gone. The world they built has turned to dust. But what they took, what they broke, became the truth that outlived them. They tried to erase names, but history wrote them back in the wind. The wind rises, carrying echoes, the sound of oars, faint laughter, the murmur of prayer. The camera tilts upward to the sky. Clouds shift, revealing a soft aurora that shimmers across the heavens. Green, gold, violet, the same colors that once guided the longships home. Only now, that light belongs to the lost. The aurora is their monument, vast, untouchable, eternal. As the light dances, the narration continues. We remember them not in vengeance, but in truth. We remember them because forgetting would be a second death. The scene fades to a series of images, quiet, wordless, each a heartbeat of memory. A rusted collar resting in museum glass. A runestone inscribed with the word freedom. A scholar brushing dust from a child's bone. A line of schoolchildren walking past a monument, heads bowed in respect. A mother telling her daughter a story, not of kings or warriors, but of women who endured. Each image lingers for a few seconds before dissolving into the next. Together, they form a tapestry of remembrance. The final scene returns to the sea. The woman stands alone on the cliff, looking out over the endless horizon. The wind carries her voice, soft, almost a whisper, as if she's speaking not to us, but to those who came before her. We are your children. We have found you. You are no longer lost. The camera pulls back, slowly rising higher, revealing the vast northern coastline. The sea glows under the setting sun, the color of molten gold fading into shadow. A single longship appears, not real, but spectral, a vision of memory, gliding across the water. No warriors aboard. Only light. It drifts into the horizon and vanishes. Fade to black. Voiceover, final words. Civilizations rise and fall, but humanity endures. The true strength of a people lies not in conquest, but in remembrance. The women who were taken, the lives that were silenced. They live now, in the stories we tell. Music swells, a slow, mournful cello blending into a haunting Nordic choir. The screen fades once more, this time not to black, but to white. White like dawn, white like beginning, white like peace. The night returns to the north like a slow tide. The sea breathes, the cliffs hold their shadows, and the cold stars burn where no ship can reach. This is where stories end, not with a shout, but with a settling quiet, a soft weight placed on the heart. We have walked through ruins and markets, through halls of fire and ledgers of iron, through the hush of graves and the blaze of aurora. What remains is not merely knowledge. It is obligation. There are two kinds of memory. The first is the kind we display, banners and busts, dates carved into stone, triumph preserved in bronze. The second is harder. It has no statue, no anthem, no festival. It is the memory of those who were never meant to be remembered. It is the memory that refuses to disappear. When dawn touches the edge of the northern horizon, the colors are not loud. They arrive like a promise whispered to the sea. Pale gold on steel water, a faint warmth on a cold world. The camera glides along a shoreline veined with tide pools, over a scatter of old timbers, past the husk of a dragon-headed prow. The lens pauses on a simple object half buried in sand, a small iron ring fused to a broken chain. It is ordinary. It is everything. We cannot return what was taken. We cannot unknot the rope that crossed 1,000 necks. But we can choose what stories live after us. That is the work of remembrance, not to loosen the past, but to fasten the future to truth. Somewhere inland, at the edge of a birch forest, a school stands where once a farmstead burned. Inside a quiet room, children gather around a glass case. There is no sword within it. There is no crown. Only a collar and a page, a copy of a ledger line that reads like a wound. Age, skill, value. The teacher says nothing for a moment. Silence is the first lesson. Then she speaks not of kings, but of women. Not of gods, but of choices. The children lean closer. They are small, but this is how civilizations change. One gaze at a time, one breath taken with the dead. In a museum, a curator arranges light on objects so that the shine does not drown the truth. In a lab, A scientist coaxes fragments of DNA from a tooth and traces a journey across centuries no map ever showed. On a fishing quay, an old man tells his grandson that the bay once had another name, a name the wind still knows. In a studio, a young filmmaker turns down the drumbeat and raises the human voice. None of these acts are grand. All of them are holy. The camera returns to the coast. A figure walks the line where sea dissolves into land. She has walked here before. She will walk here again. Her cloak is heavy with dew. Her steps leave dark crescents that the tide will erase. That is the way of it. The sea takes, the sea returns, the sea remembers what we ask it to keep. She kneels beside the chain and lifts it gently, as if it were a story with edges that can cut. For a heartbeat, we see her face in clear, living detail, not the face of one person, but the composite of many, strength borrowed from a queen, sorrow from a farmer's wife, defiance from a girl who refused to bow her head. She does not weep. She does not smile. She breathes. Survival has its own expression. Voiceover, soft as a tide turning. We speak their names in the only way we can, by telling what was done, by telling who they were, by refusing to let silence pass for peace. The wind moves through the grasses that knot the dunes. Above the water, a skein of birds bends and reforms, black ink on a silver page. The world is ordinary again, and therefore beautiful. That is the cost and the gift of truth. The extraordinary returns to the everyday, where it belonged all along. We have told the story of conquest as it was, a machine that ground suffering into wealth. We have pulled the ledgers from their hiding places and held them to the light. We have walked the markets and the halls, the caravans and the holds, and we have heard the music that was not sung. Now the question turns toward us. What do we do with a past like this? We can turn away. We can say, it was their time, not ours, and let the ledger close again. Or we can carry the weight, not as punishment, but as inheritance. The difference between shame and responsibility is the difference between a shroud and a banner. One covers, the other calls. Responsibility looks like this: a textbook rewritten to place the nameless at the center, a memorial stone that lists occupations instead of owners, a law that recognizes how quickly a person can become a number, a film that eliminates spectacle to make room for a voice, a ritual that replaces victory songs with the reading of the lost. Responsibility is 1,000 small refusals to simplify. The figure at the water's edge rises. She sets the chain down carefully, as if returning it to the earth, not as trash, but as testimony. The tide slides forward and kisses the iron with a hiss. The sky brightens by a shade. On the far horizon, a low veil of cloud parts, and a pale aurora lingers though the sun has risen, a miracle of the north, a quiet grammar of light. Civilizations are not measured only by their monuments, but by their memory. If we remember the broken as part of the building, we build differently. The scene widens. There is no longship, only fishing boats at their moorings, gulls on pilings, a boy running along the pier with a red scarf snapping behind him. The world has crooked planks and peeling paint and laughter. Empires fall, mornings do not. The ordinary is where redemption lives. We move inland once more, to a stone church raised on older foundations, to a market square where languages braid without fear, to a kitchen where a woman hums as steam fogs a window and a kettle sings. All of these are victories that leave no scars. They are not the victories of conquest. They are the victories that make conquest impossible. To those who were never meant to be remembered, you are. The hand pauses, then turns the page. On the blank that follows, a list of names begins. Not the old names, which time has taken, but the names of those who choose to remember. The teacher, the curator, the fisherman, the filmmaker, the child with the red scarf, and the woman at the water's edge. Memory creates its own genealogy. The sea darkens, then lightens, then darkens again as a cloud passes. The camera settles on the horizon and holds there, long enough for the viewer to breathe with the world. No score swells. Only the elements speak. Water, wind, the hush of distance. We cannot give them back their years. We cannot give them back their homes. But we can give them back their place. And if we do, the North will no longer be a legend of power, but a memory of people. That is how we end a story like this. That is how we begin again. The screen fades, not to black, but to the color of morning. The letters appear in small, unadorned type. Remember them. And then nothing. A silence we have learned to recognize. Deep, honest, full. The series ends where all true stories end, with a world still here, waiting to be lived better than before. The sea never forgets. It carries everything: the salt of blood, the ashes of fire, the tears of the nameless. Every wave is a messenger, each crest a whisper from centuries past. The camera opens on an endless northern ocean. The horizon is veiled in pale fog, soft and unbroken, as if the world itself is exhaling after 1,000 years of grief. A faint wind stirs the water, silver under morning light. The world is still, but alive, breathing memory. Somewhere beyond the mist lie the remains of a civilization that once believed it could outlast time. The Vikings built with strength and fire, carving their names into wood, stone, and saga. They built to be remembered, and yet, it is not their names that survive most clearly. It is the silence they left behind. History does not choose what endures. The ocean does. On the shoreline, a new generation stands where the longships once launched. There are no banners, no drums, only wind and surf. Children pick through tide-worn stones, their laughter carried by the breeze. They do not know that beneath their feet lie fragments of old iron, splinters of ships, and bones of those who were never buried. But the sea knows. It rolls their echoes gently back to shore. In the distance, a museum rises on a hill overlooking the bay, a glass and timber structure shaped like an overturned hull. Inside, light streams across displays of weapons, tools, and jewelry, but also across shackles, ledgers, and broken chains. Visitors move slowly through the space. They read the placards, they whisper, they linger. No one leaves quickly. History here demands stillness. On one wall, engraved in steel, a single line reads, "They were not forgotten, only waiting to be found." The narrative shifts, from the living to the eternal. The ocean becomes the keeper of time. The camera dives beneath the surface, revealing a ghostly world of coral-encrusted relics. Anchors, coins, blades, the skeleton of a longship resting on the seabed. Schools of fish drift through its ribs like memories moving through bone. Light filters from above, fractured into ribbons. The sea does not judge. It keeps what we cast away. It is the truest archive of who we are. A close-up reveals a single shackle, buried halfway in sand. Its iron has rusted into strange beauty, turning from weapon to relic. A crab crawls across it, unknowing. In that small motion lies the proof of continuity. Life, indifferent yet constant, reclaiming what was once pain. The waves wash over everything. Time erases cruelty, but not completely. It reshapes it into lesson. Cut to modern Scandinavia. Streets filled with life. Cafes hum with conversation. Bicycles line cobbled lanes. Sunlight glints off river canals. The world has changed beyond recognition, and yet beneath the laughter, the past murmurs like an undertow. A young historian types on her laptop by a window overlooking the fjord. She's writing an article titled "The Other Half of the Viking Age." On her desk, photographs of excavation sites, bones, and artifacts are scattered among notes. One image, a rusted iron collar, sits beside a caption in her handwriting. "Objects remember when people forget." Her fingers pause. She looks out the window, toward the sea. The waves shimmer like a heartbeat. We inherit their world not through blood, but through memory. What we remember defines what we become. The scene fades into a classroom. A teacher projects an image of a Viking ship on a whiteboard. She asks her students what they see. Hands rise: adventure, discovery, courage. She listens. Then she shows another image. A row of women chained together, eyes hollow, faces turned toward a burning village. The room falls silent. "They were there too," she says softly. The silence deepens, not uncomfortable, but reverent. The kind of silence that changes people. Cut to the coast again, dusk this time. The light is golden and heavy. Waves lap at the same stones where centuries ago, the captured were led onto ships. The camera tracks a small wooden marker in the sand. It bears no name, only a carved spiral, the symbol of return. Flowers rest beside it, half drenched by tide. In the distance, the woman in the gray cloak reappears, older now, walking along the edge of the surf. The wind catches her hair, lifting strands into light. She pauses near the flowers, kneels, and touches the marker. Her hand trembles, but not from sorrow, from understanding. Their story is not over. It is written again each time we choose to look. She picks up a small stone, smooth and dark, and holds it to her heart before casting it gently into the water. The ripples widen, shimmer, and fade. A ritual without religion, only remembrance. The camera drifts upward, a slow, graceful crane shot rising into twilight. The coastline unfolds beneath. Cliffs, villages, rivers, forests, a land shaped by the same hands that once broke and healed it. Aurora colors bloom faintly in the north, mingling with the last traces of sunset. The music builds, strings first, low and mournful, then voices, a quiet choir of women humming an old Nordic melody. No lyrics, just breath turned to sound. The world breathes with them. This is not a tale of vengeance. It is a song of endurance. Every civilization leaves behind its victims. The great ones are those that learn to listen to them. The final montage begins. Images woven like threads of memory. A scholar brushes dust from a bone. A mother reads to her child from a history book. A sculptor chisels a memorial stone shaped like a wave. A group of schoolchildren launch paper boats into the sea, each bearing a single name. A choir sings under northern lights. Each image fades into the next until only the ocean remains, vast, endless, alive. The sound of waves grows louder, layered with whispers in different languages, Norse, Gaelic, Slavic, English, merging into a single breath. The tide rises. The light fades. They were taken by force. They were silenced by power. Yet they returned in the only way the world cannot stop. Through memory, through truth, through the telling of their story. And so, as long as the sea moves, so shall their names. The waves are their voices now. The sea remembers. Fade to black. Soft text appears on screen. Dedicated to the unnamed. The forgotten. The women who endured. Then, a final whisper. The sound of a single wave breaking, and silence. The day begins the way stories end, with a horizon that looks like a page turning. The northern light is thin and generous at once, washing the sea in pale silver, lifting the mist from the dunes. There is no horn, no drum, no sudden revelation. Only breath, only tide, only the patience of a world that has waited long enough to speak. The camera moves through grasses beaded with dew and over a footpath pressed into the sand by countless unrecorded journeys. It follows the line of the coast until the ruins of an old pier come into view. Black posts like broken teeth, their shadows writing a script the sea rewrites each hour. At the end of the pier, a small gathering stands in quiet, not to summon the past, but to recognize it. They have brought nothing grand, a coil of rope, a driftwood plank smoothed by waves, a basket of wildflowers gathered along the headland. A child steps forward first. She holds a small stone, flat and dark, carved with a spiral. She does not understand all that has been said, but she knows what memory feels like in the palm of her hand. She places the stone at the edge where wood meets water and whispers a name she's been taught to say, a name that once came from another shore in another century. The wind takes the syllables and carries them out across the water. One by one, others follow. The fisherman who remembers a different name for this bay, the teacher who keeps a ledger of the unlettered, the curator whose job is to aim light without erasing truth, the scholar with dust still in her hair from the morning's dig. Each lays some small offering, a ribbon, a clasp, a page copied in careful hand. The ceremony has no priest, no liturgy. It is a grammar of gestures, a vocabulary of care. Then she arrives, the woman in the gray cloak who has walked this shoreline in every season of the story. Her feet have known frost and fire-warm sand and nights cold as iron. She stands for a long time without moving, the tide slipping past her boots, the air folding around her like a shawl. When she kneels, it is not in worship, it is in work. She ties the driftwood to the old posts with the coil of rope and lays the flowers along the beam. It becomes a bridge without crossing, a marker without mass. It is enough. We pass inland to a room alive with the texture of the ordinary, steam rising from tea, a cracked ceramic dish holding late berries, a notebook open beside a window that frames the shoulders of the sea. The scholar sits at the table, writing the final paragraph of an article she thought would only be a footnote. The words are simple. They refuse spectacle. They insist that the center of the Viking Age is not a king or a sword, but the lives pressed into service to make those things shine. Across town, a mason works at a slab of local stone. He is not carving a hero's pose or a god's command. He is etching a list that is not a list. Weaver, healer, midwife, singer, cook, scribe. Occupations in place of owners. Roles in place of ranks. What could not be named becomes what can be known. The shape of a society carried by hands that were not allowed to hold it. The day lengthens. The sea brightens. Shadows shorten and slide under boats where gulls balance like pale punctuation marks. In a schoolroom, children fold small boats from paper layered with names they've copied from a museum register. Some boats carry a single word, daughter, mother, friend, because sometimes the nearest truth is the one closest to us. They place the boats in a broad basin of water and watch them find each other, drifting slowly into a circle. Back at the pier, the tide is turning. The offerings hold. The rope darkens with wet. The flowers loosen and lean into their reflections. The camera lingers on a piece of iron half buried near the posts, maybe a shackle, maybe a ring from a mooring. Its certainty is less important than its transformation. The sea has made it part of the place. What was once an instrument is now an artifact, and what was an artifact is now an altar. Evening gathers early in the north, but today it lingers as if reluctant to let the story fall into night. The sky takes on that expensive color between blue and gold, and a thin veil of aurora emerges before the first star. People begin to leave the shore, not in a procession, but in ones and twos, like a tide reversed. The child with the spiral stone looks back often, as if to check that the sea is still where she left it. There is one task left. The filmmaker walks to the waterline with a small tripod and a camera that has known rain and salt and the tenderness of careful hands. She frames the pier, the rope, the flowers, the iron, the horizon. Then she steps back until the frame widens to include the woman in gray looking out at what cannot be filmed. The shot holds longer than comfort, long enough for the viewer to feel the length of history without cutting. When she stops the camera, nothing has changed, and everything has. We move, at last, into the home where the day will close. A kettle sings. A book is opened to the first blank page after an index. The handwriting appears, slow, deliberate, unadorned. For those who traveled unwilling, whose names were taken, whose lives became ledgers. We remember you not as the world's cost, but as its worth. The pen lifts. The page dries. In the next room, a low radio plays a melody that sounds like a coastline, rising, falling, returning. The window holds a simple theater, laundry lines, a stretch of road, a wedge of sea. Light moves across the wall in a soft green seam no lamp could make. The aurora has come inland, just enough to be a rumor. Night arrives without fanfare. The pier becomes a silhouette. The offerings become shapes. The sea keeps its voice low but steady, like someone telling a child that the dark is made of the same stuff as day. Stars unbutton themselves from the sky. The aurora leans, then loosens, then fades. At the very last, the woman in gray returns to the pier alone. She touches the rope once more, not to tighten it, but to feel the work in it. She places her palm on the beam and closes her eyes. When she speaks, the words are for the water, for the wind, for those who never got to finish a sentence. We did not let you vanish. We will not. She steps back. The tide presses forward, a patient editor erasing and revealing at once. The camera rises in a calm crane, setting the pier within the whole bay, the bay within the coast within the planet's slow breathing. The image steadies. The score withdraws. Silence takes its place, not absence, but room. Text appears in white, unitalicized, unheroic. The circle closes. The work continues. The screen fades, not to black, but to the color of the first light we met at the beginning of the story. It is the same light, in a different day.